Welcome back to our series on keys. Today we're going to have a bit more of a look at major scales. So last time we looked at the pattern of tones and semitones in the major scale, and we looked at that with reference to a keyboard that we had drawn. Now this time we're going to use that knowledge and translate it onto the stave to see what our major scale is going to look like when we put it on the stave. Because in theory exams, that's often what they're asking for. They're asking for you to draw out a scale in a particular key. So here's the keyboard version of C major with the tones and semitones written on. There's a couple of rules that we need to know. So firstly, a scale needs to use all the letter names of the musical alphabet. So a scale needs to use all the letter names of the musical alphabet. So if you were going to write out, for example, a 1 octave major scale just going in one direction, so let's say ascending, going up, then you would need to use all of the letters of the musical alphabet in that scale, regardless of what key you're in. So say we're in C major, we will need to use, at some point in the scale, A, B, C, D, E, F and G. But because it's C major, we know that we start on C. We also know that we're going to end on C. So in C major, you would get 2 C's, one at the bottom and one at the top. But all of the other letter names only come once. So let's take C major as an example. So we know that altogether in a 1 octave scale we're going to have 8 notes, and we also know that the first note and the last note are going to have the same letter name. So for C major, our first note is going to be C, and from there we want to write out our musical alphabet starting from the letter C and finishing on the letter C. And then we can check that we've got 8 notes and that each of the letter names are different apart from the first one and the last one, which should both be C. So next we're going to transfer this information onto the stave. You'll need to put your tonic at the beginning and at the end. And then you need 1 note on each line or space between the starting note and your finishing note. Once you've put on your C and your other C, you're going to need to have 1 note on each line or space in between. And we can line these up with the numbers and the letter names that we've already worked out. Now we know that C is just going to be an ordinary C. It's not going to be a C sharp or a C flat, because if it was, then that would have been the name of the key. But because it's C major, we know that our starting and finishing note is C, and it's just going to be an ordinary C natural. Now for the other notes, although you probably know what is in C major, let's pretend for the moment that we don't know. We don't know whether those notes are going to be flats or sharps or naturals. So how we can then work that out is by referring back to our keyboard and to our pattern of tones and semitones. And if we look at this, we can see indeed that we just need the white notes on the piano. We don't need any sharps or flats at all. So since we've worked out that we don't need any sharps or flats in this key, that's us done, because we don't need to put in any flat signs or any sharp signs, and we don't need to put anything in the key signature. It's okay for it to be a blank key signature. So now we're going to use the same method, but we're going to try working out A major. So first of all, we'll write our numbers like we did before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And because the scale is called A major, we know that it's going to start and end on an A. We also already know that the A is just going to be A natural. It's not going to be A sharp or A flat, because if it was, then that would have been indicated in the name of the key. So we know it's just an ordinary A that we're going to start with and an ordinary A that we're going to end with. Then we can fill in the letter names in between using our musical alphabet, remembering that we just use each letter once. Now, for these other notes, we don't know yet whether they are going to be naturals or sharps or flats. So from here, we're going to go back to our keyboard and we're going to work out, using our pattern of tones and semitones, an A major scale. So we go A to B, that's our first tone, and then B to C sharp, that's our next tone. But this is interesting, because how do we know if it's a C sharp or a D flat? Well, because we've written out our alphabet, we actually know that at this point in the scale, it needs to be a C sharp. If you think about it, we'd already established that the A was correct, so that was our number 1 note, and then we'd already established that the B was correct, that was our number 2 note. So we were on to the number 3 note, and we already had written down that that was going to be some kind of C. We didn't know exactly which kind of C it was going to be. We didn't know whether it was going to be a C sharp or a C natural or a C flat, but we knew that it was going to be some kind of C. So this third note has to be a C sharp. So we've established that the first 3 notes of A major are A, B, and C sharp. So what comes next? If we go up a semitone from C sharp, we get to D, because remember we're still following our tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone pattern. From D, we go up a tone and we get to E. And then from E, we go up a tone and we get to F sharp. And of course, we could have the whole conversation again about is it F sharp or is it G flat? But it's F sharp. And we know it's F sharp because of where we are on the scale, because we've already got our note 1 sorted as an A, our note 2 sorted as a B, our note 3 sorted as C sharp, our note 4 sorted as a D, our note 5 sorted as an E, and note 6 has to be some kind of F. So it has to be F sharp. We have to call it F sharp rather than calling it G flat. Also, I should say that in major keys, in major scales, you don't get a mixture of sharps and flats. You either don't have any sharps or flats, like C major, or you have entirely flats, or you have entirely sharps. You do not get a mixture of sharps and flats in major scales. So we can add the F sharp onto our stave. From F sharp, we go up another tone, and that takes us to G sharp. And for all the reasons that we've already talked about, we know that this is a G sharp rather than an A flat, because it's the 7th note. We know it has to be some kind of G. Also, you are never going to get an A flat in A major because the name of the key is A major. So we know that any A's in A major are going to be A naturals, just normal A's. So we are at G sharp. And then it's one more semitone, and that takes us to A, which is our upper tonic. And depending on what the question asks you, you either write it how we've done, or you might write it with a key signature. And if you're writing with a key signature, then you need to follow the order of the flats or the order of the sharps. So the F would come first, then the C, and then the G. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the degrees of the scale. And really, we've already been looking at that. We just haven't used the words, the degrees of the scale. So where we've had our number 1, or we've called it the tonic, you could say that's the 1st degree of the scale. And then where we've had the number 2, you could say that's the 2nd degree of the scale. And it goes right the way through to the 7th degree of the scale. And then you go back to the 1st degree, or you could call it the 8th, but it's an octave higher than the 1st. So really, it's just the 1st degree of the scale again. So here's an example of C major. Now, how about if you were writing the scale the other way around? So you were starting at the top and coming down. What happens to the degrees of the scale then? Well, both of the C's would still be the 1st degree of the scale, and all of the other notes will retain the same degree of the scale as they did on the way up. So C is still the 1st degree of the scale, D would still be the 2nd degree of the scale, E would still be the 3rd degree of the scale, F would still be the 4th degree of the scale, and so on. So just be a little bit careful with descending scales, that you don't, out of habit, start writing 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, left to right, because after the 1st, it's going to be the 7th, and then the 6th, and then the 5th, and then the 4th, coming down like that. The one way you could do it, if you were feeling a bit confused, is rather than go 1st, 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, you could write starting at the right and working to the left. So that's one way you could do it. And the other thing to mention is that the semitones always fall between the 3rd and 4th degrees of the scale and the 7th degree of the scale and the upper tonic. So I'll show you a couple of examples of that. Thanks very much for listening. That's the end of this tutorial, which is part 4 of an 8-part series. Part 5 is all about the order of the flats and the order of the sharps.